Okay. Welcome to Transform with Greg Carson, a podcast where we focus on the transformations of market ecosystems and the people behind them. Our goal is to dive deep into subjects that interest us and help us decide where to spend our and where to invest our time, money, and our spirit. Today's guest is Yat Siu, the co-founder and executive chairman of Animoca Brands, an umbrella group of companies with a mission to deliver true digital property rights in areas of blockchain, NFTs, and Web3. He founded Animoca, which later became Animoca Brands, focused on digital entertainment projects. And since 2018, he has steered Animoca to a leadership position in Web3, blockchain, gaming, NFTs, and the open metaverse. This is a true pioneer of the transformation of marketplaces. So I'm very excited to talk with him. And just a reminder that any views expressed in the podcast today are personal views of the podcast participant or myself and should not form a basis for making investment decisions, nor should be construed as a recommendation or advice to engage in an investment. With that, with our formalities done and ready to go, I welcome the brilliant Yat Siu. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So I guess if we're going to start off at the beginning, I understand that you're a musician. Is that true?
Yeah, well, I was studied music, and that really had a lot to do with my parents. I guess more specifically, my mom. She was a
Okay.
professional musician, and what happens when you have, I grew up in Austria, in Vienna, as a result of that. I was born and raised there, actually,
Wow,
and
beautiful city.
this was also a long time ago. So I've been a child of the '70s. So you can imagine what the world was like back then. Basically, as immigrant sort of Asian/Chinese sort of family living in Central Europe at the time. There weren't a lot of us to begin with. So, I guess, what happens when you have essentially the classic sort of immigrant story. Uh, all the stories you've heard about sort of, Asian tiger parenting, it's all true. And that's the reason why I ended up basically studying music, because today, as a parent myself, I appreciate what my mom was thinking at the time, right? She was not necessarily, it wasn't really whether I was the most talented musician around. Most certainly wasn't. That was much more around the fact that that was an industry she understood. That was something she knew. And therefore, if she was going to help me in life in the future, she could help me being a musician, because that's what she understood, for instance. And that's what she wanted me to do from that sense. And in some ways, that's what parents do often. If you're
Yeah.
a lawyer, maybe you want your children to be lawyers or take over your business. And I'm not saying that this is good or bad. It's just kind of the lens that it comes from. But I think the other reflection I would say is that, of course, in those times, it was much more common that you would do the professions that your parents would do, because life moved a little slower, right? And of
Yeah.
course, today with technology, life moves so quickly, accelerates so fast, that the likelihood of our children doing the same kind of stuff that we did is actually less than 50%. I think the
Yeah.
average study said that it would be something like 60 or 70% probability that they'll be doing
Yeah.
something entirely different from what you're doing. Right. So yes, times have changed. But yes, I was trained as a musician, although that was a long time ago.
What instrument was it?
It was piano, flute, and cello.
Oh, fantastic. Wow. And being in Vienna is like this the source. It's like the matrix source of music.
It is. It's also a great way to be humbled as a musician, because you're basically
Mozart at every corner.
constantly surrounded. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a little bit like it's like growing up in an Olympic village where everyone's a super athlete, and you're just like kind of trying to sort of just make do with your apparently great skills, but then when you actually go there, it's like, oh my goodness, right? So yeah, so I think it was a great lesson in discipline and humility, if anything.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess she could have never predicted that you'd be like transforming the entire gaming industry in the future when there weren't even video games when you were born.
Yeah, I don't know that she fully appreciates what I do today, but that's fine. I don't think.
My parents are still struggling to understand what I do as well. No matter what I do, it's always because we're both because we're kind of like on the cutting edge all the time. It's very like I think the boomer generation and the generations before us, they kind of like they grew up before television and media, so everything just moved at like a quarter of the, maybe even a tenth of the speed, and now maybe a hundredth of the speed.
It is. And I think we also grew up in an environment where classic labor was really the value, the idea of value was generated from the classic ideas of labor, right? The
Yeah.
work of your hands, the performance that you do as a musician, right? I mean, these are the classic labor ideas, right? I mean,
Hmm.
back in the days, if you took a photo, that was almost heresy for something that to be considered art, for instance, right? I mean, can you
Right.
imagine sort of tools like Instagram, from the perspective of artists, in our generation when we were children, for instance, right, our parents' generation, that is, it would have been
Yeah.
considered completely heresy, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
remember a time when I wasn't, when I was in school, using a calculator was not allowed
I
because
remember.
that was kind of cheating, right? Whereas you had to do it from your own hands and your own mind and everything. Like you were not allowed these sort of, I guess, sort of cheating tools. The world was entirely different. But of course, it's not cheating. It's an enhancement. It actually
Yeah.
makes you more creative, I would argue. But of course,
Mm.
those were different perspectives back in the day.
It sounds like creativity is kind of like part of your core. Would you say that that creativity is an important part of like your entrepreneurial journey, or entrepreneurs I mean,
Oh,
you work with many entrepreneurs. How important is creativity, and how does it fit into you and your portfolio?
so the way I would think of creativity is more about whether you're a divergent thinker, right? So I think
Okay.
creativity and divergent thinking is kind of very much tied together. And
Hmm.
I'm not a great fan of creativity as a word because it often gets sort of commingled with, are you a great musician? Do you know how to draw well, or that kind of stuff, right? And while that is of course a part of creativity, I think the part that I think the part that becomes that is more valuable from, I guess, from an entrepreneurial or from an innovation standpoint, is how divergent a thinker are you? And by that, I mean that, I think divergent thinkers look at problems and it becomes an opportunity. They see thousands of pathways. Whereas
Yeah.
if you're a convergent thinker, which by the way, there are many musicians, for instance, who become very convergent in their thinking because
Yeah.
they're trained to be performing in a certain way, right? Right.
Yeah.
So, an example, for instance, when, and how I got into the space was, I wasn't actually very good in comparison to, as I said earlier, in comparison to many of my fellow, I guess, musician students.
Right.
And so in composition, I ended up using a computer to help me compose a little faster and better by creating MIDI software. Of course, my teacher sort of didn't have any sort of good thoughts about that. But people online had similar problems. We're like, hey, you know what? I'm not that good at composition. I could use MIDI software, and they appreciated that, right? And so, whereas if you're someone who's really good at pen and paper and sort of articulating it and writing it in that manner, in some ways you're actually become an incumbent in that, right? You kind of think this is the way to do it, and then you get sort of sort of stuck in the way of things. It's kind of like handwriting. I mean, I don't know if you remember that, but there was a time
Yeah.
when I was in school where how well you sort of wrote the text, not the grammar, but like the handwriting, right, was how you
Hmm.
got graded, right?
Yeah.
Again,
I remember.
these are things that are sort of not that relevant, really, if you think about it, because it doesn't really tell you this, how well you write. In terms of handwriting, it doesn't necessarily convey the story you want to tell, right, or the depth of your story, as an example, right? Right. But anyway, sort of, I digress a little bit. I think the point is that I think divergent thinking is fundamental.
Mm.
But I also would say that all humans actually are creative and divergent in a sense. And I think similar to what some studies have said, and of course the work of the late Sir Ken Robinson have shown,
Hmm.
is that
Hmm.
actually sort of schooling and society, broadly speaking, and the sort of structures we exist in actually sort of make us less divergent, even though we're born with sort of divergent thinking mindsets. And that means there was a study by George Land and Bethany Jarvis. I'm not sure
Hmm.
if you've seen that one. Basically, what they did was they actually went and they did a divergent thinking test for I guess NASA scientists back in the 60s, and they basically modulated that test for children. right? Because, you have to be a really divergent thinker to be at NASA because, if you send someone to the moon, the likelihood of having done that before and being able to solve that based on the rule book is close to zero, right?
Yeah.
So you need to have people who are creative in their approaches. And so they did a similar test, adapted it for children, followed children from the age of 5, 10, and 15, and then gave the same test to adults. So this was like a multi-year study. And what they discovered was that children, I forget the exact stats, but you can find it online, but children that were 5 years old were
Hmm.
able to solve the problems. I think like 95 or 96% of them were able to solve the problem in a divergent manner. And by the time they were basically sort of teenagers, I think it was like maybe like 8 or 9 or 10%, some figure like that. And by the time they were adults, the same adults who took the test, it was 2%. And
Wow.
I think there's a correlation
To the
between
education.
entrepreneurial activity as well, because entrepreneurs are also a single-digit percentage of society, right? The kind of entrepreneurs who, certainly the ones that we think of as game changers, as the ones who sort of, make big impacts and create disruptive innovation, they're
Yeah.
definitely in the low single digits. And so I think there's a correlation between sort of the natural state of divergent thinkers
Hmm.
and the entrepreneurial index, who are actually, by definition, have to be divergent because they're looking to solve problems that haven't really been solved before or new approaches.
Yeah. It seems actually that the education system was designed to eliminate divergent thinking. I mean, it was basically built in the industrial
Absolutely.
era to get people ready
Yeah,
for factory city life.
absolutely. And one of the things I think that we mustn't forget is that one of the big roles of education was about putting order in society, right? I mean, you're not just teaching them sort of skills so that they could work well. You're teaching them, basically whether it was religion, or whether it was politics, or whether it was values, right? Things that tie your society together in a certain way, so that
Yep.
you don't have revolutionaries that just kind of mess things up, right? So in some ways, so, schools in the traditional sense, of course, this is different today, but schools in the traditional sense really sort of were designed to create more convergent thinkers. And in some ways, basically create human machines almost, right? Especially, during the age of sort of industrialization.
Yeah, it's probably gone too far in that direction, and then probably because there's not an active belief, and this is an assumption, but if there's not an active belief in the leadership in a government that that is the purpose, then no one's actively adjusting it on a decade by decade basis to fit to what we actually
Yeah.
need in society.
I mean, when you take a look, for instance, at the kind of places where you have a lot of innovation, some of the ingredients around that is the diversity of that place, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think, like if you look at, for instance, Silicon Valley, I think 40% of people who are sort of building companies and working in those companies are actually not from California, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
as a
huge.
result, when they, right, so as a when and actually, it says something when you look at sort of, whether it's, the sort of multi-diverse sort of ethnic people, different cultures. And so as a result, when they're building companies, they have different perspectives. They don't quite fit in a traditional sense, and that's
Hmm.
what kind of you have the birth of new ideas, and that comes from that, right? Whereas if everyone's kind of thinking the same, if it's got a very homogeneous sort of society, then you don't have the friction of these ideas. You actually don't have these new opportunities that you would be thinking of. So absolutely. But I would say also, the U.S. is unique in that way, in that
Mm.
it has a system in which it can withstand disruptive innovation that
Hmm.
creates opportunities, that
Hmm.
destroys industries, and
Yep.
yet somehow the country comes out stronger than before for the most part. That's unique. Most places in the world, actually, almost no other place in the world, has that kind of emulation. And that's the thing when we go about sort of, like education.
Hmm.
People are trying to sort of foster innovation and creativity, as they say, right? But
Yeah,
then
it's
they
big
do
in
it in
other
a
countries.
controlled manner, right? And then, of course, when you try to control innovation, actually, what you're doing is through restricting innovation, right? So I think Europe is a perfect example of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I lived in Sweden for 15 years, and I'd say there's a massive move to get innovation as part of their education system, and same with venture capital in Europe. There's a massive move to artificially, initiated in Europe because it just came naturally out of Silicon Valley, and the U.S. it's not just Silicon Valley actually. I think that if I can remember, I don't have a study, and we need to fact check it, but basically the innovative or the entrepreneurial like a class in the United States has always been basically first and second and third generation immigrants.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that makes sense, right? Because in some ways, the aspiration of America and sort of the meaning and the symbolism behind it is that people go there for better opportunities,
Yep.
and and when they go there and build, whatever businesses they do, I think partially because of this very strong, at least traditionally, capitalist framework that America has, it creates the right incentives, right? Again, like when you look at examples of sort of, I guess, Scandinavia, be it Finland or Sweden, actually they've got amazing education systems, and I would argue that Finland is perhaps one of the most forward-thinking education systems.
It's it's ranked
Emphasizing
it's ranked one, two, or three. I think Singapore just recently passed it, but it's always
exactly.
been one for a
Yeah.
decade.
Yeah, it's one of the most amazing places, and there's incredible amount of innovation that's thing sort of happened there too. But I think the drawbacks come from the fact that from a capitalist perspective, it's more restrictive, and so it
Yeah.
doesn't allow And then what happens often, and we see this European problem, is that when people start making actual sort of money, they tend to leave the country, right? And
Yeah.
so they go to the places that
They go
are
to
more
Silicon
friendly.
Valley.
Yeah, well, or they go to other places, right? And it's not to say
Yeah.
that it's just about taxes. It's kind of the whole framework as well. Because, for instance, in Europe, it's harder to talk about money, for instance, right? It's just not something that people sort of are comfortable to talk about. Maybe even
For
considered
sure.
rude in some places. Whereas in US or in Asia, for instance, you can much more freely talk about money, value, investment, and so on, as a general sort of theme, not just within a close circle of people. So I think that is part of the culture, and the US has that culture for the most part, and therefore innovation does thrive, disruptive energy, creativity in that sense, and in some ways also the need to do so is there too.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I want to talk about it later, but I mean, what do you think of? I mean, you are obviously on the forefront of this, this transformation in Web3 and decentralization. Um, you must have we just talk about the capitals in the U.S. What do you think about capitalism in general and where we stand in the whole like framework of capitalism?
So first of all, I mean, generally speaking, I mean, I'm a capitalist in the sense that I think capitalism is important.
Hmm.
It's what drives entrepreneurship and innovation. It gives people the right incentives, and I think that to me is the engine of growth, is making sure that the people around us, and the people in your population or your country or nation, whatever you want to call it, are given the
Hmm.
right incentives, so that they can sort of create awesome products that are game
Yeah.
changing. I mean, as whether and as investors, you and I and others would also look for the kind of people, but how can we motivate them if it wasn't for the capitalist incentive, right? So broadly speaking, I'm very pro-capitalist, but I think capitalism has in its current format is broken, right? And I
Mm.
think one of the problems about capitalism and why it's broken is because of the way that capital forms, it's become almost feudal in its construction. If you have money, you can much more easily make money, right? And also, I think it's partially because of the fact that most people aren't really very financially literate. And so our idea of value, there's a large group of people, I think the majority of the world still believes that most of the value comes from labor, right? The classic thinking, right? Whereas actually almost all of the value actually comes from capital as an assets, right? If you've been investing in real estate, you would have done much, much better than if you were actually working in a factory or working in a restaurant or doing some kind of work. When you think about sort of how it appreciates, right, and the value of money, for instance, and I think the other problem, of course, is, and I think the policymakers in the past did understand this, is that they appreciated that monopolies, for instance, right, are actually bad for innovation, and therefore they have antitrust laws. But these antitrust laws have broadly failed us, especially in technology, for the last few decades. And now they've created these giant monopolies that are actually doing that are doing the opposite of what capitalism does, right? I mean, what capitalism requires is a free market, so that people are able to sort of transact and sort of offer goods and services that benefit sort of, I guess, society broadly better for a more competitive marketplace. But I
Hmm.
mean, think about what happens in something like Facebook or an Amazon or Google when you actually do an advertising or when you buy a product there. Who's your market? You're not bidding against another person or another individual or another company. You're bidding at Google with an AI that basically decides, at his whatever whim it may be,
Yeah,
to
whatever
offer you
parameter
a
they
product or
put.
service. Yeah, exactly. And you have no idea actually who that is, right? And so it's not an actual market, right? So I would
Right.
argue that, and I think the problem is, of course, that
It's a
people
very
from
good
the
point.
outside say, "Oh my goodness, these companies make all this money," and these examples of what's wrong with capitalism. But they themselves are markets, like Google or Facebook or Amazon. They are markets themselves, and they are actually the opposite of capitalism, right?
Mm.
They're controlled market economies, right? Where they basically decide who gets to see what. They are kingmakers. I mean, if you launch an app on the App Store and Apple decides to feature you, you're good. And if
Yeah.
Apple decides not to feature you, you're dead. I mean, that
Yeah.
doesn't sound like a market to me, right? And I mean,
No.
that sounds more like a fiefdom, right? Basically, a king gets to decide,
It's a
whether you
monopoly.
succeed or not. It is a monopoly. And if you might remember, and this is kind of our own experience, still 10, 15 years ago, Apple used to have a ranking. They used to have
Yep.
top grossing, they used to have sort of most downloaded, or whatever, like with popular apps. And everyone went to those charts to take a
Yep.
look at what they should download. And Apple hated that, which is why they eventually removed it, because they felt that it kind of perverted
Wow.
essentially, their vision of the App Store. But actually, what those leaderboards did was they created market information, right? It's like
Yep.
a stock price. It's like a ranking. It sort of created a social index to say, wait, this is popular. So if it's popular, maybe I should try it. Or people pay a lot of money for this, or there's a lot of value for there, right? So markets feed us information. Capitalism gives us this information so we can make fair and reasonable decisions. And they removed that, for their own reasons. And of course, actually, I would argue it's hurt the ecosystem far more. But again, it
For
comes down
sure.
to thinking that they don't think, the people who design these app store algorithms, they're not people who think in terms of markets, right? They only really
No.
think in terms of what their own particular construction, how they think the app store should look like, which ones
Profit.
should be popular. I mean, that kind of stuff, right? But just to close the thought on this one, I think capitalism in its current construction is broken because also the
Mhm.
people who benefit are primarily shareholders and builders. So shareholder capitalism is not one that distributes value more fairly, which I think is important for capitalism to function, right?
Right.
Otherwise, you get back into kind of a feudal construction, which I think, by the way, is what Web3 can solve. Because to me, the solution for the future of capitalism is that we all need to own capital, as in we all need to be equity holders. But how do
Yeah.
we become equity holders when it's impossible to buy land, for instance, because it's too expensive, or
Hmm.
we don't understand anything about buying shares? Well, this is where tokenization and NFTs come in, because actually
Mm.
these represent digital property. These
Yeah.
present forms of assets and capital in the virtual world, which actually is where we spend most of our time, right? So,
Mm.
so I think of that as a way in which we can solve that. And if you think about sort of the contribution that we give to networks, whether this is an Instagram or TikTok, every person who makes content actually adds value to the network. So why shouldn't
Yeah.
they become stakeholders in this, right? So I think the future is a kind of stakeholder capitalism where every person who contributes to the network becomes a participant. And when you think about layer one, layer two blockchains, whether it's a Bitcoin or whether it's Ethereum, actually those are same representations of ownership of a
Yeah.
network.
Yeah, I think NFTs. I was speaking to 6529. He had this kind of also similar thought, which was that NFTs are particularly useful in this concept of having capital in a decentralized world because you actually own something that is not going to be on Coinbase. It's not going to be on a centralized exchange. It is uniquely yours, and it stakes a claim in that kind of like global marketplace of ownership, you might say. Whereas some of the other ones are not. The other thing I think, just to riff on your, capitalism has problems. I'm definitely a capitalist. I loved Atlas Shrugged. I've started my first company when I was 20, so I'm on the same boat. But, having, a big focus on like health and on seeing how the world's evolving now, I think it goes beyond just Facebook and and Instagram and the way they control their internal markets. It's like this concept of agency capture, which I think the social media companies are going for in the political sphere right now with with the new crypto regulations and the new, like, trying to put censorship in place and that kind of stuff. But it's happened already in the food. There's tons of laws on the books that don't benefit consumers, they benefit companies. Increasing the amount of technology they can put into food, which is poisonous or bad, but allows the shelf life to extend, or that creates disease, and they don't get, and the same thing goes with pharmaceutical and everything like that. So it is really big problem. Do you think the Web3 stuff is going to help solve all these areas, or do you think it's really just the media side and the communication side?
No, I think it solves all these areas, but I think what it solves, or I think helps solves, is the kind of broad inequity that the world is seeing. So
Yeah.
what happens is when you think about sort of, actually, sort of what capitalism has created, originally, actually, what it was supposed to do is create more broad wealth redistribution. And if you have more broad wealth redistribution, at least in the initial, it took power away from, the kings and the nobles, and then merchants themselves had a say because they had value, they had capital, they owned the land, and so therefore they had more power, right? And so really, what we're talking about is a distribution of power, and the more distributed the power is, the more balanced a landscape we can have, right? Because that's the point, right? So when you talk about these monopolies, the reason the monopolies can do bad things to us is because they actually have the power to do it. And there's nobody on the other side that can block them, right? As a result of that, right? Because
But
they don't have an equal sort of positioning around that, and that to me is kind of where Web3 solves that, because I think Web3, and not just on the technology side, actually when you have equity, shall we say, or ownership in this future wealth sort of, I guess, category potential, right? Then
yeah,
actually you end up having a say, and you have other ways in which you can counter, which you can kind of see when you think about the one percentile. The one percentile can afford organic food, for instance, to your topic of food, or they can
right.
afford to sort of, travel in certain ways, or they can afford not to have fast food and to have sort of, like whatever it is that they want to enjoy, because they now have money, which they have because they invested it. So everyone who, for instance, bought real estate, let's say in Hong Kong, over the
Yeah.
last 30 years, they're fine, right?
Yeah.
And so they have choice, right? Versus the ones who don't. Of course, that's the problem. And the issue in the world is that more and more people, so the middle class is getting squeezed out. And so you either have, a sort of super wealthy class, which is growing, but of course is a minority. And then you have essentially a sort of people who are making less money and getting worse off, and you have a hollowing out of that middle class. And I think that's frankly, I think one of the problems we have in the world politically as well, and all the unrest and so on. Because for the first time, I guess, in this generation, for at least children's generation, the likelihood of them being worse off than their parents is actually quite high, right,
Mm.
statistically, and that's actually quite shocking, which is something that hasn't happened before. So I think all nations are broadly struggling with this, and I think the solution to that is making sure that we solve inequity, and if we solve inequity, then we solve all these other things that come with that. But one way to solve inequity is to make sure that there's a more broader power, call it distribution, and the only way
Mm.
to have actually a broader power distribution is effectively a value distribution or a value share. And governments used to do that in the form of taxes, right?
Mm.
Taxes was a way to sort of basically sort of take away sort of, I guess, money from the ones who were very wealthy and redistribute it. That was one way, and really what it ended up doing was sort of managing sort of the power base, as it were. But it's kind of gone out of hand. I mean, I think the top 10 or 13 companies in the world, which are basically all technology companies with the exception of one, have $1 trillion of cash collectively. I mean, we're not talking about revenue. It's $1 trillion
Cash.
of cash in the balance sheet, and most of it's sitting in Ireland, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Because
I
of the
mean,
intellectual property
that is
rules. Yeah.
insane. Yeah, that is insane, right? And they're not putting back into the ecosystem. Like for me, it's always been a puzzle why Apple doesn't have a venture fund, for instance,
Yeah.
because if
It's
they took just
baffling.
10%, yeah, if they just took 10% of their cash, which would be $16 billion, right, or
Yeah.
give or take, I don't know, never numbers, right,
Give or
and
take.
invested it, and yeah, give or take, rounding errors here or there, a billion or so, and ended up basically putting that as a ecosystem fund for maybe just the App Store, anyone who's
It could
making
be,
an
yeah.
app on the App Store, whatever, right? What would happen? First of all, it would be a much more thriving ecosystem. Two, I think people would be much more happier to pay their 30%. Because, the 30% is a tax. But why do we pay higher taxes in Sweden? Because we get, for instance, healthcare, we get better social services, right? So we are happier to pay that tax, right? And the same here. I mean, if you
Happier.
can create an ecosystem and basically give back, that money is doing there actually is not very productive, actually. And I think that's part of the problem, right? Capital is just compounding on itself without going back into the market, creating value. And that's actually the opposite effect that people want.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I didn't actually think about that with Apple. But most of the other guys do have venture units, right? So it's why does an Apple do you think?
Well, actually, they may have venture units, but they don't have venture units for the ecosystems. I mean, just think about the number. I mean, we ourselves as a company, and because we're Web3 focused, we believe in the shared network effect, so we think it's necessary to do that. But, we have
Right,
over 450 portfolio companies, and we're not really that old, right? And I would
right.
argue that we probably have more sort of, venture investments, so to speak, than probably Facebook, Google, and Apple combined. Although, I don't have the stats out there, but it's not that I read a press release about which companies Apple invests in or Facebook. At Google Ventures, there's a Google Ventures team, but again, I would say that they're not that prolific, given their
No.
balance sheet and everything else. Again, because I don't think they think like I think these venture firms are focused on returns only, right? They're not
Yeah.
focused necessarily on sort of how you build an ecosystem, and I think they are ecosystems. So I do think that they need to build ecosystem funds in the same way that nations and countries, provide construction loans, right, or provide development funds, right? Because they want to build an ecosystem and create sort of a better environment for that. I think companies need to think about it that way as well, because companies have become countries in terms of
Hmm.
the amount of cash and the size and the markets they end up maintaining and controlling and dominating. So yeah, and the reason they don't do that, I think, has a lot to do with sort of the thinking of power, right? Zero sum thinking. I think the classical MBA school education that I
Hmm.
think many are trying to undo right now, but there was a history of, if someone else if you're competing in a market and someone is actually still in the market taking a part of your share, even if you have the largest share, whatever he took is money you lost. I mean, that kind of thinking is frankly all that's wrong, I think, in the
Mm.
space. And it wasn't always like that, right? But and I think now you've got sort of, many professors actually sort of backtracking a little bit, saying, you know what, yeah, maybe that zero sum thinking wasn't good. But we've
Right.
basically bred a whole generation of MBA kids to think that way. Which, by the way, I don't think is our natural state. Like, I don't think humans are broadly bad, right, or want to necessarily. They're competitive, but that doesn't.
Right.
But like because if we were actually people who were intentionally trying to hurt others and sort of destroy others, then society would be screwed anyway, right? But that's not how it is, right? Like I think we just educated people in the wrong way.
Mm.
But I think Web3 can solve that, because in Web3 the irony is, in some ways, that actually the more distributed and decentralized an ecosystem is, the more valuable it becomes. I mean, can you
Hmm.
imagine if Bitcoin was owned by one company? What's the value of Bitcoin? It goes straight to zero, right? Because it becomes centralized, right?
Yeah, the network
So
effect, the Pareto effect is the key effect.
exactly, and the network effects can only form when they actually are free to form, right? Right.
Yeah.
In that sense, it's very similar to like information or like open source. Like you
Yeah.
can't constrict that, right? The value starts to build because it is free to be used and utilized and create network effects from everyone. And that's the really valuable part. And what Web2 companies have done really well is they've captured, the network effects, but they've only been able to really capture a portion of that network effect. Most of the network effects get lost because they can only create value in their own way. The
Yeah.
external aspects of the network effects aren't captured. And that's kind of what Web3 can do, through tokenization. Actually, to me and to us as a company, we look at tokens as proxies of network effects.
Mm. So you look at the token as a proxy of the network effect.
That's right.
What you said Web3 a couple of times. For our viewers, we have a pretty diverse viewership. What is Web3, and how does that contrast with Bitcoin and
Sure.
And the other stuff that you talked about, like let's get the Yat Siu, definition of Web3, since you're one of
Sure.
the maybe top three company in this space. So let's hear what your
No,
definition
thank
is.
you. Well, I mean, I guess to understand Web3, I think it's good to sort of talk a little bit about some of the earlier definitions. Right? So Web1 traditionally has been viewed as a web of read, right? Which is kind of when you had websites and people were literally putting online magazines. And
Yeah.
really what Web1 did was it democratized access to information, right?
Right.
And then Web2 was the ability to write to the web. But the difference about Web2 is, of course, that if you wrote to the web, which was in the form of blogs and the beginning of Instagram and of course TikTok today and Facebook and all that kind of stuff, was that you had to write it to a database, right?
Yeah.
And the database, of course, was owned by a company because you didn't have something like blockchain, where you basically could have a public database. You only really had private databases owned by companies, and they ended up consolidating that and created a more centralized web because they created value, and data became that most valuable of resources because it became essentially the source for all these network effects, right? And so, when you think about sort of when you post a photo on Instagram, it may seem quite innocuous and harmless, but actually what happens is that you just fed the engine valuable information about location, about who you are, about what you like, and then they can sell that back to you or to others like you and create value from that, as an example, right? And so these
Right.
network effects essentially were sort of farmed by the platforms because that's the valuable part, together with the data in Web 2. And then in Web 3, you get read, write, and own, meaning that you now have the ability to own essentially a part of the network, right? So in some ways, it's like saying you could own a piece of the internet, which seems a little alien, but actually is exactly, really, I would say, what that means, right? And tokenization is the representation of that. If I was to give sort of a classic old example, it's kind of like having a share certificate in a company. You have a token which represents that, and that represents your ownership, whether this is an NFT, which is a token that is sort of unique, or whether this is something that is more collective, right, which is basically a fungible token. I mean, whatever the structure is, that's kind of what that means. So you can own a piece of the network, which means the network effects, the value of these network effects, now you can partake in, or you yourself could, basically tokenize your own company or product or your service, and then therefore you could share those network effects with others as a result of that, right? So that means in this sort of Web3 future, which well, we're already in Web3, but it's of course a minority of the network, which we think will be the majority in the future. Every end user who participates in the network ends up becoming an owner of that. And that's kind of why we call Web3 the web of ownership, right? That's what this means. And the founding principle of that is digital property rights. Because of that, you now have the ability to truly own your digital property for the first time. Like you can't own your digital property because your property is owned by Facebook, or if it's a game by Epic, or by EA, or by Amazon, or by Google, right? They own the data, therefore you're renting their property. But in Web3, because the blockchain is a public good, so it's public, and therefore your data is stored as a public good. Actually, you have sovereign ownership over your data, and therefore you have the ability to sort of get the derivative benefits from this. And so we all become stakeholders in these future and present networks. So that's how we would define Web3.
Right. So is does Web3 evolve into a web? Like, is there a next stage of this Web3? Is there a Web4 coming or?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'm a big believer in change, as in the only thing that we can be certain of is that there will be change, right? There's
Yeah.
many things we can't be certain of, but change is the only constant that we can certainly bank on, which means that we should expect that there will be a Web 4, Web 5, Web 6, but we don't necessarily know what that looks like. But it will happen. But I think one of the reasons why I think a Web 4 or Web 5 future is harder to imagine is that I think Web 3 simply mimics what we currently have in the physical world, which is property rights and capitalism, right? Inherently, Web 3 is a very capitalist framework, and I would argue also a very American framework, because the
Right.
foundation is property rights. Whether this is physical or digital, it doesn't matter. Now that I have physical property rights, which our digital property rights, and now I have the ability to have people do business with me and compose activities freely just because I own it, and I don't need to talk to an intermediary to do that. I mean, in the physical world, if you own a car, someone can come to you and say, "I'll be a driver for your car, or I'll paint your car, or I'll give you new tires." or I'll change your seats, or I'll make a baby seat for you. And the only platform actually is the fact that you own a car and that there might be millions in the world that own cars like this, right? And that's
Right.
actually the construction of a different kind of network effect, but it is a network effect. And today, a car is a very valuable sort of, I guess, device, if you will, that is valuable not because it can take you from point A to point B, but because it offers you all these other benefits and utilities that are provided by thousands of companies in the world that have nothing to do with the creation of the car or even a relationship to the car manufacturer, but add value, right? And we see
Mm-hmm.
this in all forms. Like, for instance, the fact that we have an iPhone and we can buy a case, or we have headphones. I mean, again, they didn't go to Apple to seek permission. By the way, Apple
No.
tried to do that, right? I think Apple tried to sort of, with the lightning standard and all that stuff, tried to sort of create a locked ecosystem. But
Yep.
actually, I would argue their ecosystem wouldn't have been able to grow bigger if they actually weren't required to have open standards, right? You
Yeah.
know, and these open standards therefore allowed people to compose on top of this hardware because you own the phone, right? Or you owned your house, or you owned your car. And in the virtual world, pre-blockchain, that wasn't possible. And now you have that. If you have an NFT, whether this is Land and Sandbox or whether this is a Bored Ape, people can give you airdrops, people can give you
Mm-hmm.
benefits, and they can genuinely do that because they know that you own this property and you become their customers as a result of that. And it creates a sort of real sort of open market because
Yeah.
everything is fair game, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Apple, they just now moved to the USB-C. I think Europe forced them to do that, if I
They
understand.
were forced to do that. They were forced to do that. Correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it was an ultimatum. You either open up Lightning or you absorb the USB-C.
It's something like
That,
that. Yes.
so what do you think if we like if you go back to there's the sector, there's companies, how would you obviously you have a ton of exposure to so many people in the space and previously in your games background and your entrepreneur background, what is it that you how would you define like leadership? Let's talk about like the concept of leadership. What is it that a leader should have, and like how do you define like leadership in this kind of entrepreneurial world? Obviously, there's the entrepreneurs themselves, but then you have companies with thousands of people. What is leadership in general? Let's just start there. What is leadership?
Well, okay. So, I mean, well, I think the picture of leadership may have changed over time, and I think it has a lot to do with our evolution in terms of our knowledge and sort of how we
Mm-hmm.
think about sort of information and so on. I think to me, leadership is about serving others. So the idea meaning that to be a really good leader, shall we say, because you can have all sorts of leaders, right? And they could still be effective. But I think to me, a good leader that one can look up to and that one would follow is one that actually has sort of, I guess, a servant attitude in terms of the people who are following that leader, shall we say. As in, I think it's one that you have to, how do you serve them? Meaning serve your community, serve, your employees, so that they basically can be the best at what they are to sort of drive that common purpose. And, I would say, when you think of political leaders, I think the most effective political leaders have a mindset where they feel that they're serving their nation or their country, which really means their people, right? As an example, right? And that and a company can extend to customers, right? I mean, I would say, for instance, when Jeff Bezos talks about sort of making sure that the customer is king and that they focus very, very sort of much on the customer happiness in whatever way. He took the mindset that he's serving the customers, right? He's, so, and I would say that would be perhaps, I guess, one, perhaps the most important quality, and everything else is support, right? Because, for instance, in order for you to be, to have this kind of servant attitude, you have to have a lot of empathy, right? If you don't have empathy, then it's really difficult for you to feel for your audience, to understand
Right.
them, as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but I wouldn't say it's empathy. It's the attitude of serving, and then things like empathy
So you're
become
saying
skill
it's
sets
not
that have to develop.
empathy, but you need to be empathetic when you have this attitude of service.
Correct, correct, yeah. And you can only be of service to others if you have empathy. I mean, I'm not saying you can't be, but it's just that if you don't have a strong sense of empathy, then how do you connect with your audience, for instance, that you're trying to
Yeah.
serve? Is kind of what I'm saying, right? And I mean, of course, whether it's knowledge, intelligence, all these things, they come in. But to me, these are support things, right? I think the sort of servant leadership is, I think, probably the most important principle.
Yeah, it popped into my head, the Spartan, 300, like, is that guy empathetic? And he's like, he's
But I would say he is empathetic, as in
exactly,
his
yeah,
mission and purpose is absolutely. I mean, it's pretty wild what they had to do, of course. But how do you inspire? I mean, this is the other thing. How do you inspire people to do incredible things as a leader? And it doesn't come because they're good at cracking the whip. It
no,
comes because they basically sort of show what they're doing, sort of, through their own actions, sort of, what's important. And I would say whether this is a form of sacrifice, whether it's a form of whatever it is, right? They're
yeah,
serving, right? They're out there in the front lines, basically sort of, with the troops, as it were, right? And even if they're not sort of, battling it out in sort of, are there, they are suffering with them. I mean, if you think about the so most inspiring generals in history as an example as well. I mean, they were with their soldiers. They
yep,
slept in the trenches, right? They weren't sort of, back in, like wherever, sort of guiding and directing safely back, wherever it was, right? So yeah, so I would say again, to me, it's the same thing. And of course, you build that because if you're in the trenches, for instance, then you know what it's like to be there, and therefore you understand what your soldiers are going through, and as a result, you you can make their life better, and you can serve them better. Therefore, they can serve you and your mission and your cause or your nation better.
yeah. I think in that example that he's absolutely empathetic because he understands the oppression that they felt or the anger. He's basically getting them enough energy so that they could fight for their families.
Right.
It's just a different way to, like, when you say the word empathy in our society, you think about, okay, you're very soft, whatever. But empathy, especially from a leadership standpoint, can be very tactical and can be very strong. I mean, you can empathize with someone's
Yeah.
distrust or happiness or anger or power. There's a lot of things that it could mean.
There is. I think one of the sometimes I think sometimes people confuse empathy with sympathy
Yes.
because they evoke a similar reaction, but sympathy is more like
Yeah,
like
yeah.
right,
It's a little bit
and
demean. It's a little bit like you're above them.
yes, right. Whereas empathy is actually actionable, right?
Yeah.
There is something where the reaction that is more than just okay, I feel sorry for you. It's
Hmm.
actually what can I do or what should I do, right? And I think, and you can have empathy without action. That happens, of course, but generally speaking, it evokes a reaction, and
Yeah.
therefore, I think, I would say empathy is far more powerful than sympathy, but they're kind of similar in that
They're
regard, and that's why I
cousins.
think
They're
it's important.
cousins.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why I think people sometimes relate to it in the sympathetic way, not the empathetic way.
Mm. And I guess just with your personal experience, how is your how is your leadership structure and how do you lead at Animoca?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, we're a pretty flat hierarchy. So even though, we're a much larger organization than we were, some years ago, and we have an XCOM, actually, people from all over, not that I have time to necessarily talk to everyone, but, I'm approachable in that sense.
Hmm.
And there's a fair degree of delegation of, I guess, authority in different areas, which I think is the only way in which you could scale. And I think if you look at our investment style, how do you manage, 450 portfolio companies and growing, plus our own subsidiaries and studios, whether it's like the Sandbox or, whether it's, the Rev ecosystem or TinyTap, whichever. And it comes from having a pretty federated model. And I think the federated model only works if you have, I guess, a values and sort of mission alignment that comes from essentially kind of driving a certain common purpose, which I think is, again, sort of driving from that leadership style of, at least trying to drive from the leadership style of this kind of, I guess, servant attitude, right? How can we
Hmm.
help you? Right. And of
Hmm.
course, as you grow, there's resource constraints and all that kind of stuff. So it's never perfect, but it's something you
Hmm.
strive towards. Um, and I think the ultimate thing, obviously, that we all want to serve as well is sort of our audience. And I think going and so even though we have an organization, what we need to always make sure that we're serving is our audience, which you could translate as customers, but we actually consider our customers as stakeholders. So we don't consider our customers, because I think the word customer sometimes feels very extractive, right? A customer is someone that you want to take money from. A stakeholder is someone that you will share value with, right? And so that's kind of one of our core sort of purposes as well, that we want to build a stakeholder economy where we all sort of share together in everything, as it were. And I think it comes from a little bit from my own personal sort of upbringing, because growing up in Austria, which is a socially democratic country, but my mom basically she used to work in Eastern Germany at the Komische Oper in Berlin when there was still a wall, right? And that had me sort of experience what real communism looked like, right?
Yeah.
And then going to America afterwards, because of work, and experiencing capitalism, at quite an extreme in comparison to Europe. And then going to Hong Kong, where it was literally capitalism unchecked, like it was, with
Right.
all the problems that come with it, right? I mean, we still today, sadly, in Hong Kong, have 70, 80-year-old people dragging trash, right? As an example, right? That's an example of what happens when you have sort of extreme capitalism that actually doesn't have that much sort of social security pressure. And okay, Hong Kong is improving in that area, but it started late, right? We didn't have any kind of sort of, I guess, pension funds structures until really when I first came to Hong Kong, which is like 30 years ago, right? For instance, right? So all these things evolve later. So seeing all of that, I guess, is sort of gave us as an organization the thought process as to how we think about Web3 and what we think it can solve, right? This whole idea about being stakeholders and creating more equity, we think it can solve that. But the lens of understanding that comes from, I guess, our own personal experiences and what we've seen in the world, so that we have empathy for that situation. And I think this is, frankly, I think one of the big reasons why Web3 will continue to grow, because I think the only place in which you can build more equity for someone who's not in the 1 percentile is Web3. I can't think of any other industry where that can happen. And that, by
Yeah.
the way, I think is also one of the reasons why the original internet sort of grew the way that it did. Even though there wasn't a value construct in terms of like tokens, the opportunity to be heard, to build a
The
media
voice.
company,
It was a
get more
voice construct.
distribution, exactly, was way more powerful than anything else before. And really, it democratized that and brought more people opportunity. And I think Web3 is actually that, but supercharged.
Right. And I guess, we were talking about like the concentration of wealth and how that was evolving. You know, how will Bitcoin affect that? Like if Bitcoin keeps going up in value and the US dollar and other currencies keep going down, how could that possibly change the macro environment and the concentration of wealth or the transfer of wealth?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Bitcoin, obviously, the origination of Bitcoin helped grow this industry. I look at Bitcoin a little bit like, the gold standard of the metaverse, or it's like the
Mm-hmm.
Web3 gold standard, right?
Yeah.
And I do eventually think that there will be a decoupling of that. We're not there yet.
Right.
I mean, the gold standard wasn't decoupled from the US just like what 50 years ago. I mean, like what sort of pre-Nixon, right?
Yep.
Up
Yep.
until then, it was still the gold standard, and then so again, this idea that we have sort of modern economics as it is right now is actually not, it's pretty modern, right? It's not been around for
Yeah.
hundreds of years. And so I think, Bitcoin will be the same. Not that it will take 50 years, but there'll be many, many more years where Bitcoin
Mm-hmm.
is kind of, I guess, the gold standard, the peg that
Yeah.
basically, if Bitcoin does well, then the rest of the industry goes. But eventually it'll depeg. And I think, and to me, this comes down to the network effects, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
as I mentioned earlier,
Is that
we
deep
look
peg
at
up or
tokens.
deep peg down?
Well, just depeg, as in basically not there won't be the same correlation anymore.
Right.
In the same way that we don't have correlation with economies and how much gold you have.
Yeah.
Basically, I think it'll depeg in the sense that Bitcoin can go up or down. It won't have an effect necessarily on these
On
new
all the
token
other stuff.
economies in due course, right? And that has to do with the inherent network effects that come from them. Because right now, the network effects aren't deep enough yet, right? And
Yeah.
so Bitcoin is kind of sort of holding that in many
Yeah.
ways. But eventually, when people are building, and like we look at L1, L2s like nations, right? And people are building products and services and creating economic opportunity and games as metaverses as well. And eventually, they will get to a certain size where the economic activity, the network effects inherent of those sort of ecosystems will be maybe become larger themselves. And I think that to me is the sort of wealth, sort of I guess wealth distribution aspect,
Mm.
because these network effects are already there. Like we're playing games, we're online all the time, we're
Yeah.
sharing photos, we're doing all that kind of stuff, right? We're
Hmm.
just not able to share that value across because it's owned by a single platform, right? And so let's just do a thought experiment here and just
Okay.
imagine if Instagram, had a token economy, right? And if
Hmm.
TikTok had a token economy, right? And whatever, name your Web2 giant and imagine that they were token economies, right? Well, a few things would happen. The first thing would be that everyone would grow with the ecosystem because if Instagram was growing, and I would be more encouraged to sort of upload photos because I knew that not only would I receive tokens for it, the value of the network would grow, for instance, as a result. And
Yep.
we all become stakeholders in that process. Actually, there would be not only more wealth distribution, there would also be wealth going in the right areas because the ones who contributed appropriately would receive these rewards because it's all transparent, right? Um, and so that is kind of one effect I would see, but also because token economies are basically interoperable, right? They
Yeah.
they they can bridge across. So that means these network effects co-join with others, and we see this today with L1, L2s when you bridge liquidity across. When we talk
Yeah.
about interoperability, we don't just mean interoperability as NFTs. We mean interoperability as ecosystems. If you might remember
Yep.
5 years ago, everyone talked in constructs of Ethereum killer. And now everyone's talking in terms of how you bridge and connect to each other, right? Because you want to
Yeah.
sort of share and co-join in these network effects. The result is that the ecosystem isn't just larger, it's also more resilient, right?
Mm.
And that's actually how we see that future, right? I mean, some Web2 examples. I mean, why isn't it that that Uber drivers don't receive shares in Uber? I just never understood that. It doesn't make
Yeah.
sense, right? And what would happen, right? Because of course now Uber is like, well, eventually there'll be self-driving cars, so we don't need drivers. So thanks, thanks for all you did, but basically,
Yeah.
bye bye. I mean, like that. That's terrible, but also you're not actually creating a healthy framework of a network, and you create an adversarial relationship with the
Yeah.
very people who help build your business. And by the way,
Hmm.
that's the problem we have in Web 2. Whether you're a creator on YouTube, whether you're a creator or producer on Instagram, or whatever it is, it ends up being an adversarial relationship because you don't have a stake in it. Right? And I think
Yeah.
Web3 will solve that. And therefore, because all of us become creators in one form or the other, like we see this when people are farming tokens in 10 different games. Actually, what they're doing is that they're cross-pollinating ecosystems as well. And
Yeah.
the traditional thinking for people who don't understand this would say, well, I mean, that doesn't make sense because the games are free. Well, games are never free. Actually, what happens is those people who are playing the games for free, they provide the entertainment for the people who are paying for the game. Because in the
Right.
gaming industry, we have only a single-digit conversion rate, right? So all you 97, 99 percentile players who play for free, you're the ducks that people
Yeah.
get to
You
shoot.
are the
I mean,
product.
you are the product, right? And
Yeah.
therefore, why should you not be paid for that? Instead, that value goes straight to the actual game company. And in Web3, the value is shared, right?
Right.
So that's the thing. But because people don't understand it, they don't understand money, they don't understand value distribution. It's kind of hidden, right? You don't really understand, that your transaction was worth something. I mean, imagine every time you shared a photo on Instagram, and you knew that that photo will ultimately create a net value of, I don't know, $5 or $10, and that your activity in Instagram over the course of the year was worth tens of thousands of dollars, for instance, you would completely think differently about your
Hmm.
relationship with Instagram, right?
Yeah.
But the fact that they don't say this to you is actually to their advantage
Yeah.
because they don't want you to know how much money they make from you, right?
Right. Yeah. And how and just to read to go back a little bit down where we were before is how is the you were talking about leadership in Animoca. How is the? I think we spoke about this when we were together in St. Moritz the other day. How is the leadership structure of Animoca? It's a massive amount of investments. I think the ownership is also pretty distributed in your company too. So like, how does that all? How does that all gel together? From like, if maybe you can give us detail about how the company's owned and constructed and
So
how that top
Animoca,
layer
yeah, exactly.
works.
Yeah. So Animoca is a public company,
Okay,
but
it's a
it is
public
a
company.
public
What exchange?
unlisted. No, no, no. It's unlisted. So
Okay.
it's a public unlisted company.
Okay.
We have something like 2,800 shareholders.
Wow.
And basically, even the largest shareholder, which is me, has maybe 12, 13, 14%, something like that, give or take, right?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and everything is quite distributed. And if we have to make major decisions, we actually have to go for a shareholder vote. And it's all
Okay.
common shares. So we don't have pref
Mm-hmm.
shares, we don't have a special class, right? And that actually creates a very interesting kind of governance and reporting and so on. And you'll find us basically not just doing financial reporting, but you also find us basically making announcements and of things that we think our communities need to know. Whereas, for instance, if you're a private company, it's up to you whatever you want to share. Whereas we feel almost like there's an obligation for us to share to our communities
Mm-hmm.
as a result of that, right? So in some ways you could say, and by the way, that's also why we are so excited about DAOs. We're kind of quasi DAO, right? Just through a shareholding structure, right? DAOs, however, have a mechanism in which you could ultimately govern, have a governance structure where you could have millions of token holders, right? Whereas
Yeah.
with shareholding companies, you can't do that. I mean, you can't really manage a company that would have millions of shareholders. That would be very, very difficult, right? Like in our case, for instance, when we have to go through major resolutions, we actually have to print a prospectus physically, right?
Really?
And we have to send it. Well, because it's still stuck in the old ways of, well, you have to inform your shareholders. You have to make sure they're notified, right? The email isn't enough, so you have to basically make sure it gets in the mail and that they've had enough time to see it, right? So, which is the reason why sort of, I guess, corporate shareholding companies, you have to have like a 28-day notice. You have to prepare stuff in advance. So the whole process takes months before you can even issue something, which makes it slower. Whereas in a DAO, you could literally do that within a week or two, or maybe even just days if you needed to, for instance,
Yeah.
right? So these are all things that I think sort of in terms of the future of organizations, I think DAOs are really, really interesting experiments in terms of how to more democratically run an organization.
Do you have a board of directors?
We do have a board of directors, right? The independent board of directors, the ratio being two-thirds is independent. And we also have, an XCOM, which is basically our senior leadership that basically reports to the board. But then we have, our subsidiaries, which are running a pretty federated model and are fairly independent. Like if you take a look at companies like Sandbox, for instance, I mean, they run very independently,
Mm-hmm.
but are still part, of the family of Animoca brands. And then on the investment side, we have an IC committee, and that sense is quite classic, right? But
Mm-hmm.
still, I would say, we run fairly autonomously. Like for instance, I'm not approving, most of the investment decisions these days, right? It's like
Who is
I
doing it?
can't, right? Yeah. We have teams that sort of assess and so on. But people do approach me about deals, investments, and I pass it on, and maybe I make recommendations. But broadly speaking, I would say that it's become quite sort of I guess, in some ways structured, but I would say also fairly federated, and therefore much more decentralized than I would say classic organizations. Right? And I think the fact that we have a common shareholding structure and that things are subject to change, and that even I could possibly, be voted out of the company if I, did some really bad stuff, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
I think is a very different type of structure than someone having a golden share or a VC that has not just pref rights but extra voting power because they
Yeah.
have because they led the last round, right? And that's also one of the reasons why many top VCs have pref shares and want the majority of the pref shares, as in the 51%, because it effectively gives them control of the company for certain key decisions. Which is again very different and creates a totally different power dynamic, which I don't know that is necessarily always good. But of course, that's what they want to do to so-called protect their investment, right?
Yeah. Are you? You said it's kind of democratic. Is there like a? I mean, did you choose? You chose your executive team, I'm guessing, and like, Is there some sort of like way that the board or the executive team is revisited all the time? I mean, like it's quite remarkable to have such a
We have to do
minority.
annual elections. We have to do
So
annual elections
you are
for the board.
elected annually by the board, by the
Mhm.
shareholders. And how many shareholders vote?
Uh, well, I would say, I mean, when I look at the our virtual meetings are quite well attended.
Yeah.
So, I would say we probably have about a third or more of the shareholders that
Present.
vote.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the most recent one. We had our last AGM basically at the end of last year,
Okay.
and not every not and just if you look at the voting records, they don't all vote like 100%. Like
Yeah.
there's no vote actually, to be fair. There's not a single vote that is ever unanimously sort of agreed on, right?
That's great.
And there's certain provisions that require, basically, sort of supermajority as well, and they
Mm.
don't always pass, for instance, as well, right? You can you sort of part of your job is to educate your shareholder base or your holder base or your token base, whatever you want to call it, to understand what it is that you're doing, so that they can then vote appropriately, whether they agree or disagree, right?
Yeah, I find it quite remarkable and amazing because you've been. I guess how long is Animoca? It's about 5 years now, 6
Well,
or
so
10.
Animoca as a public company has been doing this since 2015.
Okay.
Pre-Animoca Brands, we started it in 2011. That's essentially when it was, I guess, a sort of not a public, a private company in the classic
Yeah.
sense. Yeah.
It's remarkable to be in leadership position, to be CEO for that amount of time with this kind of open. It's very common that CEOs that don't put that golden vote or don't have that kind of control basically end up getting pushed out or you know making there's decisions that go against their wishes or something like that. It's quite it should be something to be very proud of. I'm very impressed, like that you have been able to run such an interesting and well positioned brand for so long, and with this very unique structure.
It doesn't come without. It doesn't come obviously without its challenges, in the sense that we have to be, quite good at, I guess, communicating, which we can always do better on, right? But I would say also, it's been an incredible education process for us as well, and I think I've learned a lot about leadership. Running, I guess, to some extent, a public company, right? And I guess again, it comes down to sort of, you're serving your audience, you're serving customers, you're serving your shareholders, right?
Yeah.
And that actually is sort of this mindset and attitude that I think has been very helpful.
Very interesting. And are you what do you see as the future for Animoca now? Like, what is your plan for this year during this, in crazy bull market that we're having, and the market seems to just be unlimited potential at the moment? And what is the 2 or 3 year plan?
Well, first of all, I would say that while it is feels like definitely like a bit of a bull market, it is not as crazy a bull market, I would say, as it was, in late 21 and 22. And I think a lot of it has
It's
to
not
do
over
with the
yet.
fact that, yeah, well, yes, but also I think it has, I think people are a little bit more sensible because the memory of what happened isn't forgotten, right? I think
Yeah, exactly.
that's really important. And I think the audiences are also much more aligned, right? When you think about what happened in 21, 22, many of the people who joined Web3 didn't experience 2017, 2018, 2019, so they didn't know what that was like.
Yeah.
So that's the first point, I would say. But also, they were different audiences altogether, right? The 27, 2018, 2019 crowd, and to some extent 2020 crowd, were a certain type of, I guess, Web3 blockchain person that
Yeah.
was not sort of there for the same reasons that the 21, 20, sort of 22, 23 crowd was, which is much more culturally focused, much more
Yes.
NFT focused in
Yep.
comparison to the ones who were much more financially focused, right? And so while they're still all there, the ratios have changed, right? And so I think this run feels very different as a result of that, right? For instance, when you think about NFT sales, I mean, they average right now about 1.5, $1.6 billion a month, which is, pretty healthy, right? But also, um, the number of NFTs that are sort of sold in each collection often number in the single-digit percentile, or in the case of like Mochaverse, I think less than 1% of those NFTs are available for sale, because people want to hold them and use them, as opposed to 2 or 3 years ago, maybe more than half of the collection was up for sale because everyone was just, the only purpose was speculation, right?
Yeah.
So again, there's a maturation of the market that's there. So I think that's changed. But I mean, in terms of Animoca, what's next? I mean, we've, of our 450 investments, we have over 150 game investments. We think, gaming, GameFi, NFT gaming, these are all going to be really, really sort of crucial for the next 12 to 18 months, because they're going to onboard, all these millions of new users into Web3. So that's a big focal point. And we've, many of our products and investment portfolios have launched, right? The Mochaverse is a key part of that. That's a key initiative. We think of that as like a decentralized Steam, where we can basically share our user base across multiple games as a start, but extend it from there, and use that as a distribution sort of, I guess, sort of mechanism for Web3 games, but where the end user is the sovereign owner, not us, right? So that's a
Yeah.
key point. It's a soulbound NFT that you own as an ID, and if you own the Mochaverse NFT, then that's yours as well. And for instance, Pixels, which was a fairly successful launch, Mochaverse basically drove, at that time, almost a third of their traffic, for instance, right? With our community. So that's kind of a big initiative. We want sort of many more of our game investments and portfolio companies to basically launch through Mochaverse, because we can help them really grow. The other area I'm really excited about is education. Education, gaming is a big space today. It's a $200 billion space growing, but education is a $5 trillion space, and it's quite fundamental. And I think one of the things that we're doing with Open Campus, for instance, and TinyTap, is not just educating about Web3, but just broadly bringing Web3, I guess, mechanisms and how more equity for teachers, for instance, through Open Campus and TinyTap, so that they can actually know what it's, to protect their intellectual property and actually monetize that. That's another one that we're really excited about and pushing forward. And I mean, most recently, even sort of CZ started tweeting about his new education effort, Giggle Academy, right? Which is again something interesting. How I think the industry is now looking at education and Web3 mechanisms, or just Web3 education broadly speaking. So we think that's going to be a big, broadly sort of big macro trend that I think will be developing. But yeah, I mean, I think our end goal for all of this is Web3 adoption. And I think one of the big missions for us is that once you fully onboard a person from Web2 to Web3, they also become financially a little bit more literate. And that changes everything, right? If you think about what happened with Axie Infinity, Roland, and Pixels in the Philippines, you could clearly see that, people who had no financial education, maybe didn't even go to college, maybe didn't even finish high school, and here they are basically understanding what money and value through basically a blockchain game, right? And now, even just a few days ago, the New York Times had a big story about how crypto is roaring back because of blockchain games. I mean, the New
Okay.
York Times of all publications, right? So yeah, it's
Wow. So
exciting.
you think games is really the next, do you think games is the big on board this next 14 months? Is your true belief?
I think so. I think so. And the reason why I think that is because gaming is a great way to storytell as well, right? I mean, if you think about what is the way in which the younger generation sort of receives their culture and receives their stories, well, it's not radio, certainly. It's not necessarily even paid media. I mean, maybe it's TikTok, but the one that's engaged, of course, in terms of interaction is games. 3.4 billion people in the world play games and already have a relationship with their virtual goods and assets as one of ownership, even though they don't have it. So I think
Yeah.
it's and virtual currency inside games, again, while it's not a one-to-one example, is quite representative of token economies as well. So I think the education process is easier than to go to someone who actually doesn't understand at all. So that's kind of why we think video gaming could be a really, really big onboarder. And so far in the first quarter of this year, it's proving out to be, in terms of growth. I mean, Pixels has, I think, 500,000 daily active users, for instance. I mean, the gaming the Web3
Wow.
gaming ecosystem is thriving, and really onboarding people who've never been in Web3 before.
And so is the onboarding happening as it's actually bringing gamers? No, it's actually creating gamers because it's this kind of
It's
economic
been both.
side, or is it taking
It's been,
gamers and converting them to crypto? Or I guess you're saying it's both.
yes, it's both. And I think one of the things that Web3 gaming is doing is it's creating a new kind of gamer.
Yes.
And it's a gamer that owns assets, which didn't exist before. And then they interact with the gamers who are actually much more active in the game. And then they have sort of economic examples, and economic relationships with the ecosystem, which they didn't have before. And so I actually think that'll also have the effect that it'll expand the gaming ecosystem, not just in terms of revenue, but in terms of audiences, because your relationship with your game as one of ownership changes the dynamics and
Yeah.
adds a layer of a meta layer that didn't exist before.
Do you think they're fun enough?
I think they're fun. I think one of the things that's interesting is that, first of all, fun, I would say, is very much a relative concept. If you talk to a person, back when we sort of moved to mobile games back in 2010, 2011,
Yeah, yeah.
many of the console gamers that were playing, and PC gamers looked at Angry Birds and those type of games, and they said, "What is that? I'm not going to play a mobile game. That's not a game, right?" Or Mafia Wars, or remember how gamers used to make fun of Farmville? They was like, "Oh, that's not a game. Who cares, right?" Well,
Yeah.
guess what, right? Spawned some of the big game companies in the world, right? Or Candy Crush. They used to make fun of Candy Crush, right? But
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that our conceptions of what we think is fun is individual, and that's okay. But just
Yeah.
because I don't think it's fun doesn't mean it should be fun for someone else. Some
Hmm.
people, one of the most popular games in history is chess. Well, how many
Yeah.
people in the world think that chess is super fun? I mean, a lot of them, if you go to chess.com, and we're actually doing something with them with AnyChess. But there's a whole bunch of kids you talk about chess and they go, "Wow, what? That's boring." It's like, to them, it's like listening to classical music, right?
Yeah.
It's a it's a and again, there's not a knock on classical music. It's just a difference of opinion as to what you like or not, in
Yeah.
terms of the rules or the gameplay or whatever, right? And so, when you think about people who are, you know, in the stock market, for instance, some people describe that as a game in itself, for instance, right? And
Yeah, it
so I think
certainly is.
asset ownership is a game too, of sorts, right? I mean, game theory is
For sure.
applied everywhere, right? So I wouldn't say it's just that whether you think it's fun is a defining factor, and quite a few people, in traditional games, don't understand or don't appreciate that owning
Yeah.
things can be just as fun. But actually, when you think about people, baseball cards, Pokemon cards,
All the
collections,
collectors.
stamps, art, right? I mean, that's fun. They're not doing it just for value. They enjoy it. They think it's
Yeah.
great. They love it. And it's because of ownership that they can do that. And now they can do that in the virtual world.
That's a good point. It's a good point. And for sure collecting was fun when I was a kid, and for sure I didn't actually think of it until we just spoke now that it's not that you're trying to, you are actually making a new type of games, and that could be a very big category. Um,
Sure.
and I've always, coming from some game background, in the 20s, I made some games, and I helped IBM launch their game division with the MMOG unit, and I worked a little bit on the strategy around the cell processor for the PlayStation 3. Um, there is this there is this kind of like prejudice that people in the game sector have, which is, oh, okay, it's it's not fun enough because it's not World of Warcraft or it's not Call of Duty. Um, but the reality is you're probably expanding the game category, and I think at one point you will have some convergence of these things coming together, and it
Oh, yeah.
might come from the traditional game size, it might come up from yours, or it might be a new game. And it's very cool that you're kind of cornering that market. Is there is there is there regulation? I know that I like to chat about regulation, but is there regulation in the game sector, Web3, or
Sure.
is it?
So there is some regulation in France
Yeah,
around NFTs. So if it's an NFT game, there's a certain age range and that kind of stuff. because they treat it at the moment as a similar sort of category as sort of, I guess, because there's an sort of because of the fact that value and money is used, so they kind of put that in a similar box.
Yeah.
But that's currently being debated, of course. But in most cases, all around the world, certainly in most places in Asia, for instance, or even the Middle East, for instance, Web3 and blockchain games, using NFTs is not regulated. And I think this is definitely an area that will continue to evolve. But I think so far our communication with most regulators in the world is that that's not an area that they wish to regulate. Like, for instance, nobody really wants to regulate NFTs. And frankly, I think NFTs should be more something in a consumer protection arena than
Mm.
necessarily as a financial sort of like a sort of the classic sort of financial regulatory approaches. I mean, there
They
could
couldn't.
be
I don't think they can. I mean,
crossover.
how can they
Yeah.
really regulate it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And I think also when you start regulating that, actually what happens, you end up stifling an industry as well. And I think sort of, many of the sort of countries are quite aware of that. So, for instance, when you look at Japan or when you look at Hong Kong, actually they've been very clear about being very supportive of the ecosystem. And that they're more focused, like Hong Kong is more focused around the exchanges, for instance, right?
yeah,
And the issuance of sort of, maybe stable coins. When it comes to NFTs, they generally speaking just want people to just continue building and growing and doing what they is. And of course, the nature of tokens is that they have many sort of they can be multifaceted. So you
hmm,
can still create a financial product out of an NFT. You can fractionalize it. You can sort of connect it to an
sure,
RWA. And again, that doesn't mean just because it's called an NFT that it doesn't suddenly become a financial product, right? The same principles still apply, right?
yeah.
But NFTs as game items or as collectibles or as digital fashion, I think those are fine.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and I guess if more regulation comes, you risk regulatory capture just after it's there. So once it's there, okay, there's a regulation, and then some big player, either an old one or one of the new ones, comes in and influences the regulators or influences the legislator, and the regulation can go sideways very quickly, which we've seen in many countries already.
Well, I think the biggest problem about regulation is even if the regulation isn't necessarily friendly to the big companies, only the big companies typically can afford to implement the
Lobby.
regulation, right?
Yeah.
And so when you think about, I think, what GDPR has done for Europe, noble as the intention was, the cost of being GDPR compliant basically has ruled out smaller companies to be in industries that only big companies can now do. And so the
Yeah.
biggest beneficiaries often of regulation are the large players, right?
Yeah.
And that's the irony, of course, right?
Yeah, it goes back to our earlier discussion: food, pharma, military. I mean, like the food
Yes.
industry, all regulation just basically makes it almost impossible for farmers or small shops or butchers. They just don't. They're just not able to exist in the big societies anymore. I think, you know, in my opinion, there has to be some sort of reset there because it's just not working.
Well, I
What
mean, I
about
think
your?
that
What
comes
about
down to value, how value is shared, right?
Yeah. What about your? I think you are involved in the Web3 regulatory landscape in Hong Kong and stuff like that. Is that true?
Yeah,
Is
so
there
I'm
some stuff
I'm a
that you're
member
working on
of
there?
the yeah, I'm a member of the advisory task force for Web3, and we help basically sort of advise the government on certain policy or suggestions and share thoughts. And I would say that it's a pretty big group of people now. But I think
Mm-hmm.
what's good is that it's mixed of between people in business like myself and government.
Mm-hmm.
And also when there's consultation papers that come out, we notice
Mm-hmm.
that when we sort of put suggestions, a lot of them are taken up, right? And actually quite a
Okay.
few people contribute thoughts around that. So like for instance, the most recent stablecoin sort of policies, we responded to that, and quite a few of our thoughts were incorporated, for instance. So yes, so
Mm-hmm.
so we are actively engaged, and I think it's great. I think there's not many places around the world where you can engage on policy work or at least sort of have a say, shall we say, uh,
Yeah.
uh, you know, well, as compared to other places around the world that maybe shall not be named.
We will not name them. They will be boop boop
Yeah.
boop and boop. Okay. But what is is Hong Kong passing a stablecoin law? Is that what you implied? Is that going to happen?
Well, I
And what is
mean,
that going to look
yes.
like?
I mean, I think. So I'm not fully at liberty to talk about everything at this moment in time, but
Hmm.
the stablecoin, the responses and the reactions to the first responses have already been published, which
Hmm.
basically means that Hong Kong itself is very seriously looking at some form of stablecoin policy. And you should expect, I think the one thing I can say is you should expect probably, stablecoin issuances in Hong Kong to happen probably this year. Yeah.
Okay. Issuance, you mean that be like authorized by the government. It's like, hey, it's okay to do it. Yeah.
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
think that's
Yes.
all I think all the jurisdictions I've heard of are planning to pass this year, which there is some sort of high level coordination, I'm guessing, and I think that's very good for the digital asset world
I think so.
because
But it's also, I think also if you think about ETFs, right? I mean, I think Bitcoin spot ETFs are going to be coming out in many other countries. So I think Hong
yeah.
Kong, London, Singapore, Tokyo, like they're all going to start having sort
Well,
of, the
they've been
Bitcoin
out
spot
actually
ETFs.
for a lot of. I think Canada, Sweden, Germany have had them for ages.
Yeah, but I mean the expansion of that now because of the
Yeah.
narrative will continue to
Yeah.
grow. And I think what I think will be interesting to see is, which place will have the first ETH ETF. Like you can already find GameFi indexes that have been created with GameFi tokens,
Hmm.
which aren't an ETF yet, but are basically, people have set up indexes already in preparation for
Hmm.
that. So yeah, I think it's just going to be really interesting.
Yeah. Wow. That is a good point. I think it seems to me that if stablecoins get regulated in a nice way, a reasonable way, that it will strike a lightning bolt into the digital asset world, which is good. And I suspect that the regulators don't realize, and I hope they're not listening here, but I don't think that they realize how much power they're going to give the digital asset community by making the stable coins, totally validated. Because right now, your incentive as a as a citizen, you need to have a bank account to do stuff, and you can't really go put all your money in stable coins because it's in the gray area that doesn't have real banking services. You can't get your ATM, that kind of stuff. But as soon as they pass this legislation, first of all, it's going to create the biggest lender to the U.S. government of all time because all of them are going to want T-bills as their collateral, or going to be in. I think the U.S. will actually enforce that. And second is, why would you ever have your money in a bank if you can have it in a bearer-based, decentralized stablecoin? And especially when they start loading on top of that, like ATM access and credit card access, and you'll have these decentralized wallets, which is your Tether or your USDC or your UN stablecoin wallet that has all the services the bank has without any of the risk that the bank's going to run away with your money or get shut down.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, I think when you think about stablecoins, the way I like to think of it is actually it's the perfect bridge from
Perfect.
the physical, right? The perfect bridge. But that also means that it's connected, right? Because, when you think about the threat, the implied threat in terms of a
Hmm.
nation state, an entire digital currency like a Bitcoin, for instance,
Hmm.
historically, pre-ETFs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Would be considered, a threat because it's money out of the system completely. But actually, with the ETF, in the larger the ETFs become, the more connected, and some people might sort of actually bemoan this and say, "Oh my goodness, this is bad," because now Bitcoin is part of the system and it was always meant to be sort of against the system, as it were, right? But actually, you're not going to get mass onboarding by basically sort
No.
of fighting against it in that manner, right? And I think stablecoins are for that reason, not just because it's associated and related to a currency, but also you need to have whether it's T bills or dollars or whatever it is, you need to have these assets in order to issue this token,
Yep.
and therefore you create a relationship and a correlation between those markets, which I think makes, frankly, I think policymakers a lot more comfortable, right? For instance, right? So,
For sure.
now in terms of the custody of the assets, I think the custody of the assets are going to be one of those things where I think that a tokenized sort of a digital tokenized ecosystem will be more transparent.
Right.
For instance, I know where the money is. I know what's happening. I know the
Yeah.
sort of macro sort of transactions. And I think it forces banks or intermediaries to be more open as a result, which is kind of important because you want to know
Yes.
what's happening, for
Well,
instance,
they won't be
right?
banks. There will be
But I,
something in between.
yes, but I don't, yes, and to that point, I don't think though that the role of the custodian will disappear
No.
because I think the convenience of the custodian, I think to me, to maintain decentralization, you need just enough people to be decentralized. I don't think you need everyone to be decentralized. I don't think that's realistic, for instance. And
Right.
also, when I think about how decentralization happens, when you think of the classic delegated model of a democratic system, as long as your capital is sort of, in this case, right, held by, I don't know, hundreds of sort of verified custodial companies around the world, then that's also a kind of decentralization as well, right? Because it's not like you need to necessarily have, basically every single sort of, person in the world have that. You just need enough of it. And I think what will happen is that you might have, because of insurance, for instance, right? You might have a large part of your assets in a custodial provider and a small part of your assets perhaps in your own decentralized wallet for like fast transactions and that kind of stuff. And that kind of creates that balance. Like in the same way that, you don't need 100% of every citizen to vote to continue to have a democracy. You just need
Certainly,
enough
we
people.
don't get that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so I think we might get 105%.
Well, yes. Yeah. That's a different topic altogether.
We won't watch that. We'll have more beeps
Yeah.
in the countries we mentioned.
Well, we need, I mean, that's what blockchain could solve, right? But anyway,
Yeah,
yeah.
for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. And I think that that's got to come, and there will be some revolutions. But I see stable coins. I've been, me and a couple of my colleagues, both at Humla Ventures and before when I was at XPTO, we call ourselves stablecoin maximalists, which is
Mm,
that stable coins are delivering all the promise that Bitcoin originally offered. Um, Now, keep in mind, I don't think that's permanent. It's the Trojan horse. It's just going to bring the masses to decentralization, and
mm,
then Bitcoin and maybe one or two other networks will emerge as like, oh, by the way, you don't have to be tethered to that country, and you're already online. You already have a decent. This is once it gets approved, there's going to be a whole mass of people that just come to digital asset because they can have digital. They can just have digital stable coins. I have a coin that's my bearer. I can put it in my pocket. I can cross a border with, $1 million or $2. I can send it to my friend. I can send it to my family and, my family back in Brazil, with without talking to Western Union and paying 30%. It
yes.
does
Yes.
it promises all these things, and it's El Salvador is the first, and Malay is coming with Argentina, and then you have the unofficial, you know, technically legal countries, Venezuela, Lebanon, Nigeria, where stable coins and Bitcoin have already taken hold. So it's a very fascinating topic.
It
Hey,
is
I
absolutely
know
fascinating.
I know we're tight on time for you. Are you? I just want to be cognizant that things are going okay for you, and you want to spend a couple more
Yeah,
minutes, or you want to?
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay,
Yeah,
great, great. What do
we're
you?
on a
I mean,
roll. So let's go on.
in my opinion, it's just the. I think that this is really the most fascinating time because the ETFs broke everything open from a Bitcoin standpoint, but the court cases, the SEC, basically you have like the SEC's essentially failed in all their prosecution, of like, getting some of these bigger. Is that going to go to Hong Kong as well as how is Hong Kong going to be? I think you do business in Hong Kong or you live there. Is that, do I remember correctly? Or
But I mean, Hong Kong is, Hong Kong. I mean, we're an Australian company, but most of our big part of our operations are in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is technically our headquarters. Yeah.
where is the best place to be doing digital assets? Is it Hong Kong? Is it Dubai? Is it Singapore? Is it Silicon
Mhm.
Valley? Is it
I would say,
Antarctica?
I
Where,
think
where
it's a
is it?
bit of, yeah. So I would say it's a bit of a toss-up
Yeah.
between, in my mind, between probably UAE, as in Dubai, and Hong Kong.
Okay.
And I think there's a difference between the two, meaning that Hong Kong is a relatively new entrant. But and I'll get to sort of the ingredients of that. But it's a relative new entrant. Like in some ways,
Mm.
places like Singapore have been much earlier, but
Yeah.
they've sort of stepped back a little bit because of what happened with FTX, and I think they're sort of still contemplating in that mode. Whereas Dubai has, been doing this longer and has continued to sort of plot that sort of course in terms of wanting to be a digital asset leader, for instance, and so on. So there's a balance between the two. But I think it has a lot to do with you as an individual, what you're trying to build, and markets you're trying to open. Right. So I think that if you're in the space, you are almost required to have a place in both places, right? In the same way that
Yeah.
you can't conduct business in Asia out of New York, right? I mean, it'd be great if you could, but generally speaking, it's hard, right? So if you want to address the Asian market, then I think Hong Kong is the best place for that. If you want to address the Middle East and to some extent extend into Europe partially, right? Then I think Dubai is a good spot. And of course, you can operate in other places in Europe as well. But my point simply is that those I think are the two best places. And by the way, I think there was a good article about this, but I think the term is not that it is necessarily crypto friendly in the sense that it means that it's just sort of easy. I think that's the mistake here. It's that it's crypto that you have clarity, right? And I think that's all you can ask for, because once you have the clarity, then you know how to play the rules and what you can
It's like
engage in,
games.
and therefore yeah, and then exactly, and then sort of what your parameters are, and there's certainty. I think that's really what our industry is asking for. Just tell
Yeah.
us what the rules are,
Yeah.
so that and I think this is the sort
So
of
we can
big
game them.
mystery to me. Yeah. Well, okay, but also I think because then it's a level playing field. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's the point, right? If there is rules that we can follow, then there's a playing field that others know what it is. The problem is like, for instance, in the US, you actually don't know what the game is, right?
Yeah, they've really
And I
failed
think,
hard on this concept.
yeah, yeah, and I think, and it's kind of trying to create, like, literally trying to create fear in the market, I think. And this uncertainty is actually causing all the wrong type of companies to sort of grow from that, because and do things that normally, in some ways, I think the legitimate companies are being hurt more by this
Yep.
activity than the ones that ostensibly you're trying to protect against, right?
Oh yeah.
And so again, very strange, very, very strange behavior. But I personally take the view that I think the whole sort of anti-crypto sort of narrative that you have in some parts of the US, again, not all parts of the US, because obviously the courts
Yeah.
don't seem to agree anyway, right? Is politically motivated. Like, I don't think
Yeah.
it has, and to me, the fact that, at least previously, all the top candidates on the Republican side all came from basically Florida/Miami, right?
Yeah.
Um, and also the fact that I think from a political standpoint, it's somewhat fashionable for some to go after the people who are sort of, I guess, considered wealthy,
Yep.
because it's sort of a populist narrative. And
Yeah.
so, of course, going after people in crypto seems to be sort of a populist theme to some extent.
I don't
But I
think
think
populist per
post-election,
se, but I think politically charged. I think populist is a tough word right now because you have a clear, you have it clear almost 50% or 40% of each of the sides is so polarized. So what does populist really mean?
right,
Actually,
it's fair.
I could counteract my point is that I think that if you spoke to people without a camera in the room on many of the policy issues and you left just candidates out and parties out, you just said, okay, this policy, you talked about it like
Hmm.
immigration or this policy about
Sure.
economics or whatever, I think that you would get 80% of the population would agree on very much on
Mm.
many of these policies. But then you clump them together, and then they match them to people and personalities, and they start to do it. So I think you could be right, and I think crypto is it's being unfairly attacked for sure. I
But it's
think it's
only in the
also
US.
only
But
in the
it's
U.S.
only in the
exactly,
US.
and the U.S. is
Yeah.
shooting themselves in the foot, and I think they're also
Yes.
underestimating the power of the crypto, the 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 power of the crypto iceberg of lobby which can emerge.
Well, and I think this comes from the fact that as more and more people make money or have value or create equity through essentially, Web3
Yeah,
and crypto, that becomes a more powerful lobby in due course, right?
yeah,
And I think the difference, though, I think about Web3 and crypto, and this is the irony, which is why I find it so confusing, is that I think, crypto is as American as it gets, right? I
yes.
mean, the idea sort of, the freedom-loving, liberalism, capitalism. I mean, like, oh, this is so American. And so from the outside, It just seems really, really bizarre that you would be sort of doing that, right? But I think the other thing that I think eventually the U.S. and again, once the U.S. decides that it's going to sort of go all in, I guess, as like we saw with Bitcoin spot ETF, like even when it was begrudgingly, I guess, accepted because of a court case to some extent, right?
Yeah.
Is that the U.S. will sort of accelerate very quickly in the space. Is that it's leaving essentially the market open for other areas to take over.
Yeah.
And
Well, Hong
I
Kong and
can't
UAE
remember.
are taking advantage of that.
Yeah, exactly, right. And I can't. And Hong Kong is really, think about it. Even though it's independent, it is definitely on the financial side a proxy for China. It's always been the Chinese intermediary between renminbi exchanges, for instance, or stocks or whatever, right? And that's also politically why the U.S. has been targeting Hong Kong in the past, right? Just because of its important role
Hmm.
as a bridge sort of for China, right? So I think it's in my certainly my living memory, I can't think of any other technology category where the U.S. has willingly almost surrendered its leadership
Yes.
that it used to. That's
Oh,
really
yeah.
bizarre to me. Yeah, and
It's bizarre.
I don't think they'll be okay to do that for the long run, right? So
It's
my sense
symptomatic.
is
I
that
think it's
post
symptomatic.
elections, yeah, yeah,
It's a
yeah,
symptom. I think it's a symptom of a broader problem, which is ironically probably connected to fiat, to the overprinting and the fiat mindset of unlimited capital resources, and them feeling that, this is threatening that kind of like money printing, power creation, taxable system. But you're right. It's very likely that, I mean, if the US was ever to just come out with a clear set of guidelines, boom, 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 it would just go like this.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I
You
think,
know,
and therefore, you can never discount the U.S.
no, no, I don't think so. Why is Hong Kong better than Singapore? What is exactly the policy that they've done that's eclipsing Singapore? Because Singapore was so clearly, the crypto digital asset place for a good 5 or 6 years in Asia, and
Yeah.
now you like without
So,
hesitation didn't even consider them.
yeah. So part of it has to do with the fact that post FTX, a lot of people in Singapore were affected by that,
Yeah,
and it became very politically charged. Because one of the key investors at the time was Temasek, which of course sort of was embarrassing. But
yeah,
it wasn't that the amount was large. Like in relative terms, it's not really that much money, especially for a group like Temasek. But of course, politically, it provided sort of, I guess, some kind of sort of ways to go after, I guess, the incumbent powers in Singapore. And so it would be, and so there was a distancing from the political leadership on things of crypto as a result. And so I think as a policy framework as well, it cooled off, right? And things that people were trying to do cooled off. And again, it's not to say that people in government don't want to support crypto. It just became really, really sort of a hot potato. Like you didn't want to
yeah,
talk about that, and
yeah.
and the media also turned against it. So everything kind of went sort of opposite and sideways. So if you started suddenly being pro crypto, in Singapore, it was kind of like political suicide for a moment, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And whereas Hong Kong seized the moment, and partially because Hong Kong wasn't affected in the same way, but
Hmm.
also Hong Kong is more hungry because for those of you who might not remember, Hong Kong had the protests which basically
Yep,
caused a lot of people to leave at the time.
yep.
Had basically ended up with sort of getting categorized like China, so which meant sanctions applying to China would be applied to Hong Kong, which is not true for other countries. Like other countries don't treat Hong Kong that way, but the US does. And then we had COVID, right? Just to top
Yeah,
it off, like cherry on top. Let's just just
yeah.
just make things
Done.
even worse,
Let's shut
right?
everything down.
So 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 Hong Kong really went through 5, 6 years of hell, right? And so coming out, Hong Kong was like, okay, we need to sort of define ourselves, and we need to sort of own a new narrative, and that's what I find exciting as well. Because in some ways Hong Kong was complacent. People would just move to Hong Kong and do business because it was the gateway to China. It was international, had very
Hmm.
reasonable tax rates, easy to do business. Legal structure was based on common law. So again, all these things that were straightforward. And then, they became complacent.
Yeah.
And now, they're like, okay, they are hungry. And I think that's exciting too. I mean, they have a Web3 fund supporting marketing activities for
Interesting.
Web3, right? Like they're subsidizing conferences that are coming here, like all that stuff. I mean, it's the, and that's why I say it's better than Singapore right now, not just because of the policy frameworks. I mean, the HKMA, which is the monetary authority, I think maybe it was last year, actually sent a memo to banks in Hong Kong saying you have to help. Basically, crypto companies should have the ability to open bank accounts too, right? Now,
Wow, that's
can you
great.
imagine? You can find that online, right? Like, can you imagine any other place in the world where the regulator sends a message to the banks and says, "Hey guys, we know that you're not making it easy for Web3 companies to open bank accounts. Think
Yeah.
again." I mean, like
Yeah.
so that to me is
Well,
just
El Salvador did it.
yeah, it's a different level of engagement and support, I would say.
Yeah, that statement alone basically made the, makes the paradigm shift, which is they're like, hey, you need to make this. I mean, imagine the SEC doing that, or the European Union doing that in France or Germany. Like,
Yeah,
hey, we really want you to
yeah,
start accepting crypto companies. I mean, that would be, it would be
yeah,
a shock. It would be a shock.
yes, yeah.
That's super fascinating. So where do you think Bitcoin and well, what's your where do you think Bitcoin is going to go price wise in the next by the end of the year and by the end of next year? I have to ask. I mean, you can't actually have a podcast if you don't ask that question. I put it away at the end though.
Yes, of course, of course, of course. So I mean, like, I think the cop out answer is 100,000, right?
Yeah,
I think, but I think it's more than realistic, I would say,
for December.
from a conservative standpoint. Yeah, right. Because I think there is, barring any major market events that who knows, because after all, our industry
Hmm.
is still in a very volatile stage. And then by the way, I think it's because it's so capitalist that it retains this volatile stage, right?
Yeah,
In its early stages, right? And I think this is the other thing, just on that topic, a lot of people sort of critique basically our industry because it appears volatile. But
yeah,
actually, capitalism is inherently volatile because
yeah,
they're sort of representations of agents of change, right?
yeah.
If it's not for capitalism tells us what's happening in the market that's volatile, right? Like and I often have this sort of debate and discussion with people because they're like, well, like other places are not that volatile. It's not true at all. Like how many businesses open and close every year? How
Oh,
many
it's
jobs are lost and regained every year, right?
yeah,
The issue is though, because it's not on chain, we don't see it. So
yes,
we don't know, right? And therefore we think it's stable. But
yeah,
actually, on a macro basis, it's actually very unstable because businesses close and open every time, right? I mean, I think Hong Kong alone has like, I don't know, 2,000 restaurants that sort of close and open every year,
yeah.
like some number like that, right? And you
Same with New
compound that by
York.
the number of places. Yeah, right? Right. And so don't tell me that's stable, right? Or,
And
don't
the
tell me the
financial
stock
markets
market.
are artificially stabilized. That's the whole Fed and the quantitative easing. That is basically just optically stabilizing this kind of financial layer above what is a normal boom bust cycle in businesses.
Yeah, but actually, what it's created is incredible instability for people's wealth, and
Yeah.
and and so the inequity that's caused is actually, I think, a
Or
different and maybe even a more sinister kind of instability,
yeah.
because people don't even realize, right? Because the thing about a volatile market is people can see that it's volatile and they go, okay, how do I react to this? I need to be on my toes. I need to figure it out. Whereas
Yeah.
here, it's kind of insidious. You don't actually know because the sort of numbers don't necessarily change, right?
Right.
I mean, Japan most recently just sort of abandoned their big sort of monetary experiment, right, where they basically
Hmm.
sort of had negative interest rates for a long time. I think it was 17 or 18 years. And now they abandoned that, right, as an example. But again, this also created sort of this sort of false sense of, I guess, security when that wasn't there, right?
Right.
And but then the other way is the proxy of the stock market, right? The stock market, is very volatile, right? For all those reasons, right?
I think actually I think the yen actually had some problems yesterday, if I remember, if I noticed. But I think that it is a very fascinating time. So you get 100, you get your number is 100 for the end of the year, which is very kind of like a kind of a boring answer, but it's a good answer.
Yes.
But what about the top? What's the top before it comes before let's say what's the highest number it's going to get to before it has like a 40% decline or a 50% decline?
Okay. So I think of this slightly differently, right? In the sense that, when I talked about Bitcoin as a gold standard, I think its big decline will come when there will be this eventual decoupling of sort of the quasi gold standard of Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and by the way, I don't think that's going to happen necessarily anytime soon. And I also, it's difficult for me to sort of make a prediction in terms of whether is it 200,000, 300,000, 500,000. Some people say $1 million.
Yeah, who
That's
knows?
hard. And the reason why I think that's hard is because we're making, like, I think the measurements on fiat to me is the difficult part,
Yes.
because fiat itself is the part where how many more trillions of dollars are being printed at that point in time is as much an indicator of the value of the value
Bitcoin.
of what the Bitcoin might be or not. But rather, what I will say is that in relative terms, I think it's possible that other networks, in this case, not necessarily even Ethereum, but other networks will emerge that will eventually sort of maybe they won't have as much value as Bitcoin as a single collective, but basically as a collective right now of the entire ecosystem will probably represent
Bitcoin will go
much
down
larger.
as a percentage.
Exactly, that's right.
Hmm.
Right, and I think that will happen, and therefore, obviously Bitcoin won't go away, but I think that will basically be the capping and the changing of that, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to just price goes up, right? I mean
Right.
that's because inherently, the value of these networks is their network effects,
Yeah.
and unless you have much broader adoption of Bitcoin, and which things like Bitcoin spot ETF and so on are helping. But
Yeah.
again, a Bitcoin spot ETF isn't giving its utility. I would say the most exciting utility that Bitcoin has finally experienced is, inscriptions and ordinals, right? I mean, that's
Yeah. Right.
actually given it a purpose, right?
That's
And
your
which, by the way,
DNA at
also
Animoca.
it is. I mean, we do these projects as well, with Darewise and with some of our portfolios, and Life Beyond, and Sparks. But I think the whole point on this one is so that, like Ethereum with NFTs, right? It actually created sort of the need for new sort of L2s and sort of optimization and scaling solutions, and we see the same with Bitcoin. So that's exciting. And I think again, it embeds culture, which again is exciting. But I think because of the hard cap that Bitcoin has, I think it has a more exclusive nature to it than
Hmm.
maybe some other newer blockchains that will be emerging. And therefore, I think it will have some kind of limit because of the power structures inherent,
Yeah.
meaning that if you're a new user, and it has nothing to do with money in terms of the relative sense, it has more to do with I guess, the distribution of that power, right? So there's no mechanism in Bitcoin to sort of redistribute that value more appropriately, shall we say? Because a lot of people in Bitcoin are just hodl, right? So, right? So,
Right. Right.
so they're not really spending, right? And that's not good. That's just not good, right? Um, and um, and you need to have a way in which that value gets distributed across, whether it's through spending, investment, or that kind of stuff, so that you actually create an ecosystem around that, right? Which
Yeah.
in the other ecosystems, whether this is Ethereum or Solana or whatever you want, right? Even though they're smaller, it's much more prevalent, right? These sort of investing in projects and new token launches and new GameFi projects or whatever, much more prevalent, which creates economic flow and creates activity, right? And that to me, I think it's currently the different flavor, right, of
Yeah.
activity, and that's why. And which means you create more network effects, right? And so if we agree that network effects is where the value is, then
Mm-hmm.
the rate of network effects that are constructing in other, like Ethereum, for instance, or EVM, is just much faster for the time being than in
Right.
Bitcoin. Right?
Although Bitcoin does have a surge, there's quite a few. I'd say there's at least 50 companies that have capitalized at over
No
20
question.
million valuation, which didn't happen
Yeah.
at all in the last cycle. It's a
Yes.
whole new
Yes.
category with the ordinals is driving the inscriptions and stuff.
Exactly.
So
And
it's
and
exciting.
and to me, that it is exciting. So again, I wouldn't write it off, but the challenge there is much more visible than just
Yeah.
simply the store of value, which
Yeah,
was the
exactly.
previous narrative, right?
Yeah.
And the thing about ordinals and inscription, I think one of the reasons why I think it's so pivotal as well, is that it provides basically a way for the network to be sustainable for miners to maintain above, sort of beyond just the price, right? Because in order for the network to sort of sustain itself, you have to expect that Bitcoin will always constantly increase in value, which isn't necessarily the only solution when you have other forms of, I guess, mining revenue. And I think inscriptions and ordinals are a perfect answer for that.
Interesting, interesting. And there's actually a funny feature of Bitcoin, which I don't think people notice very often, which is that because it's essentially the only asset, but specifically the only currency that has a fixed supply, it has a very specific number, it actually becomes the de facto measuring stick for all currencies. It's a ruler. You can measure a currency in Bitcoin. Before you had this complex
Yeah,
fabric of exchange rates, and you could never really tell which ones they are, and like which one is more valuable. And actually, there's a funny website, a Fiat Market Cap, where they actually rank all the currencies denominated in Bitcoin. It's very fascinating, and like it
yeah,
used to have all the inflation rates as well, but I think some nefarious forces had the guy take that down, or he just stopped doing it. But it is a very interesting thing that is since it's a fixed supply, it's always going to be the de facto measuring stick.
and I think the interesting thing, of course, of that is that again we go back to sort of the gold standard question, right? That's why I think Bitcoin sort of has the sort of gold peg kind of sort of reputation, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that still puts Bitcoin as the store of value narrative, right?
Yep. Yep.
Now, when we talk about network effects, it's a bit different because I think, and then I think this is where sort of other networks do have an advantage because if you're a newcomer into an ecosystem,
Yep.
you have to deal with, I guess in this case, value incumbents, shall we say, right?
Yeah.
Because
Exactly.
you have people in the Bitcoin ecosystem that literally have billions and billions of dollars of value. And in some ways, even though it's not the ethos of it, they are your overlords, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you basically go into a new network, then
You have
actually you
more
have an opportunity.
relative power at the
Exactly.
beginning.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
that's the power distribution issue that I think Bitcoin will face a longer term challenge. Not today, right?
Yeah.
But a
Yeah.
longer term challenge. Yeah.
That's a very good point. The network effect is going to be tough for them to capitalize on. Well, there is an exception to that. The exception is if they pass a BIP, or if someone cracks the code of getting layer twos working on Bitcoin, then they could
Yes.
they
But
could even it's conceivable you could even have EVM technology on top of Bitcoin. That
yes.
would be like a
And,
game
yeah,
changer.
and I think that would be the innovations that are out there. And I mean, it's also interesting to see, how some of the Bitcoin maxis reacted to ordinals or BRC20s,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And again, I would
Triggered,
argue
triggered,
that that
triggered.
lends. Yes, or triggered. I mean, and I would say that triggering, which is very similar, by the way, how many of the ETH maxis reacted when CryptoKitties came out and ERC 721, right? Same
Yeah.
way. That I don't think that it has anything to do with the technology in and of itself and the innovation, but everything to do with power, right? In some ways, right?
Yeah.
The power was taken away. It's like, wait, it wasn't designed for this. This is my baby. This is my playbook.
Yeah.
We played these rules we played the rules that we designed, for many years, and now some new guy comes in and changes the rules and
Well,
appends
the rules weren't
everything.
changed. He figured out how the rules had inefficiency.
Yes, but true, but creating a different playbook, shall we say, a
Yeah,
different playbook
exactly.
that played to his advantage, and as a result, upsetting the existing power base. So yes, I mean, at the end, I guess it is still a relative power struggle, as it were.
Yeah, it is hilarious, but also amazing at the same time. I mean, like I've always seen Bitcoin as a monetary play and a Rails play. And
Mm.
the one thing that it has for Rails, which you've just kind of like you've upset some of my conviction about it because of this network effect. It's a very good point that the network effects are going to be tough for Bitcoin. Um, and I'd say
It's
the
not impossible.
contrast,
It's not impossible. Yeah.
not impossible, but also the contrast. Well, the other element, I wouldn't say it's a contrast or a contrary point, which is Bitcoin has the benefit of being, the most secure network that's ever been.
Good.
Right?
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
a
And I
it's
think
a network that is monetary and it's more secure than any there's any system, bank, database, telecommunications network. It's the most reliable thing there's ever been. That's technology. And that I think can still overcome some of the network effect problems for solutions that need that.
correct. I
Right.
mean, certain great solutions for I mean, beyond banking grade, even
Yeah.
those applications, no
Debt
question, no
transformation is
question
what I'm
whatsoever.
thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And also, when you think about sort of, how you store value across, when you start bridging assets across, the
Yeah.
interoperability of that, I think, becomes, I want to store some stuff on the
Yeah.
Bitcoin network. And then eventually I store, but maybe for other things I store it somewhere else. I mean, that's actually how that will operate. But I think I look, for instance, as a family of, immigrants into Europe, right? Actually, I look everything from a national lens because I guess that's how I think about stuff. And the place that all of us, certainly in the 80s and 90s, wanted to go to was America, right? And why
In
did we want to
California
go
when
to
it was cool.
America, right? Yeah, well, generally America was the land of opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And there was also perception, because when I actually went to America, it wasn't anything like that, that it was more free and more fair and it was democratic and, all that kind of stuff, right? And despite the fact that when I actually went to America, it wasn't actually quite that.
No,
Actually, it
no.
was like,
Well, you also came. I don't know when you came, but it's gotten worse progressively.
well, I came in, well, basically at the early 90s, essentially, was just at the height of the recession, of that recession.
Yeah, oh,
And it was
yeah,
pretty bad. It was broken in twice and,
yeah,
people were begging and it was pretty bad. But
yeah.
anyway, and I grew up in Europe and, in Europe, our impression of America was Baywatch and Night Rider,
That
my
is. That's
favorite
how it is.
basketball.
That's how I grew up. It was like every day was Baywatch and Knight Rider.
Yeah. So that's what I thought America was. And then we went there, wasn't anything like it. However, the idea of America never left, right? And I think that is the power of that place.
Hmm.
And I think the opportunity to go to a place where you actually feel like you have that opportunity and that there should still be some freedom and there should be all that stuff. And that there's a more level playing field, true
Yeah.
or not, right, is what
Well,
actually gave people hope to do it. And I would say that's the thing from a sort of L1, L2 sort of narratives, I think is equally important. And I feel like Bitcoin has more of an exclusive, currently, more of an
yeah.
exclusive reputation,
Permission.
partially also because of how much has been mined, because of the fact that essentially,
Well, it's been declared a
the value.
commodity.
Yes, right, right. And so sure, BlackRock can get into it. That's great, but the sort of, I guess, let's call it regular person outside of it as an investment instrument, and having access to that, of course, is of benefit. Everything else is kind of hard for them to build in that because they'll always feel like they're going to be the smallest player in that area, right? And I think that's the part that new networks have an opportunity, and we're so early that I think it's hard to sort of say who will be the definitive sort of player. But also, by the way, I don't believe that these networks will go away, as in I think that there will be many, many blockchains out there for that reason. Right? Kind of like nations, like we don't have just one country in the world, right?
Right. No. Yeah. Despite them trying, it's
Yes.
definitely not yet. And I think that I don't think we'll see anything like that until we have a unifying event, like aliens come or some sort of natural disaster, or the one that the people don't mention is I think energy discovery. If we do discover, if we are able to implement, hydrogen or nuclear, like a thorium nuclear in some way that makes energy essentially free, that's the only thing that can allow a global unification to start happening. Is too big of a energy is too rare for us to get to that point at this point. But
Yes.
it is time. So you didn't actually answer my top of the Bitcoin number. So I gotta come back and just ask you for a number.
Can't get away from it. Um,
Just a guess.
so
That's not
I mean,
advice. We already had the disclaimer.
no.
I'm just
So
curious because you're so into the space.
I am so into the space, but I would say, so I mean, the round, beautiful number is obviously $1 million. But I would say by the
Before it goes
time it
down.
reaches some, yes. Before it goes down. Oh, but it
I
will
mean,
always go up
it'll
and
go to
down.
a million eventually. I think most
Yes,
people might say that, but
but
like,
it'll always. I think that's hard to say because it always goes up. It'll always sort of have this sort of jaggedy edge because
yeah. Oh,
again,
bear
it's not
market. I
real.
mean, the bear market is going to come back, and
Yeah.
it'll go to 100, or it'll go to 200 or 300 or 400, but then it'll go right back down to 70 or something like that.
Yeah. I think one of the elements around the volatility in the space, of course, right now, of course, is I think uh, you know how people play the market as well. I think the more distributed it becomes,
Yeah.
eventually that jaggedness will become much smaller over time, right? So in other words, you won't have, like for instance, I think the 40-50% type of drops that you might be you're referring to, I think those are going to be things that will have less likelihood of happening over time as more people end up holding and owning it, right? Because then it's just
Right.
more distributed, right? So I don't, for instance, I don't think that I certainly don't hope, because if we are at a point where something like Bitcoin has that kind of volatility 10 years down the road, then I think we need to take a look at our industry as a whole and say, okay, what happened here in terms of our distribution? Because to me, that means that we don't have quite as many holders in the space and participants in the space as we would hope. Like our view would be that Web3 will replace Web2, right, as a predominant form of the internet. And when that happens, price volatility will still exist, but won't be, for things like Bitcoin, shouldn't be as volatile, because of the fact that it's held so widely and is much more distributed, right? So maybe to answer your question more specifically, I think the 40-50% type of volatility will be something of more recent times, right? And I think if it were to happen, it would be when Bitcoin is still in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if we do get to the point where Bitcoin is $1 million, I don't think it will have that kind of volatility. In the same way that, when you look at real estate in Palo Alto, for instance, right, or Beverly Hills, right, obviously you have volatility, but you don't have 50% type of volatility. You might have a 10% price drop and then it comes back up again type of thing because of its scarcity and its desirability.
Right. Right. Okay. I think that's good. I think that's a good step. Are you uh are you going to be going to any big events next? You're currently in
Yeah,
Korea.
I'm
What's next for
here.
you?
There's Build, there's ETH Korea here. Then after that, there's the Web3 Festival in Hong Kong. Then I'll be in Paris Blockchain Week. Then
Okay.
I'll
I'll
be
see you
at
there.
Web Summit, and then I'll be at Token 2049. So yeah, I'll be all over the place. I mean, we
If I
travel a
remember,
lot.
yeah, you basically have been like you are the most attending CEO in the space.
I don't know if that's true, but anyway, I am definitely one of them. I think so, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. But we did that for different reasons, right? Like in last year, 2023, the reason we did that is because we wanted to make sure that people were still in the industry, right? So because
Yeah, yeah,
there was so much like despair, and we just wanted to tell people,
yeah.
guys, there's a bigger mission here. Don't worry about the price. We're
Yeah.
here for something bigger, right? Which is
Yeah.
totally true. So in 2024, like and again between myself and our XCOM team, we have different people talk at different events. Um, like Robbie is kind of like he's in tons of events as well, right? And then Seb at Sandbox, he's like
Yeah.
talking everywhere as well, right?
Yeah, of
But
course.
this year, I'm going to try and focus my time a lot more on non-Web3 events as well. So that's why I'm going to Web Summit and talking about
Okay.
that, right?
Great.
Because I feel this is the right time to evangelize the space to people who are not in our industry as well. right? And have them look at it, because I think it's the right time to do that. So it's a different type of effort as opposed to last year.
Okay, that's a great. I think that's a great mission, especially for the sector and for those other sectors. I think a couple of my portfolio companies will be in some of those as well. I'll see you
Yeah,
at Paris and in Token, of course.
yeah.
So we'll have to meet up there. Man, this has been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate
It's
you
been it's been
joining
it's been
me.
a it's been a much longer chat than I thought, but it's good fun. Yeah.
Good fun. We touched on a lot of subjects, and I think a lot of stuff that we gotta, we'll revisit maybe next. We'll maybe pick a time a year from now and see if how all of our predictions and our worries have have evolved. But
Yes.
it is the most amazing transformation that in my lifetime, um, certainly in probably any lifetime, just to be watching this unfold and to be a part of it is it's quite
Mm.
amazing, and I
I
appreciate
think
you
it's a privilege.
sharing with me and all the listeners. Um, I think that wish you luck on Animoca, and wish you great luck on helping to transform the industry more. And thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Let's see here and.